take that off until I get home. I'd like to add my welcome to each of you this morning. It's a beautiful Sabbath day. Last Sabbath, it was all we could do to get up the street out here in front of the church with four-wheel drive. So by the end of next week, we're supposed to have at least one day of 60 degrees. So spring is on its way. This morning, our scripture reading is taken from Philippians 2, 1 through 11. If you gain courage from being united with Christ, if you receive comfort from his love, if you enjoy fellowship together through the Spirit, and if you possess tenderness and compassion, then you make my joy complete by being more like-minded, loving each other more deeply, and being more closely united in the purpose and truth. Don't let selfishness and pride be your motive, and don't try to make a name for yourself among the churches. But in humility of mind, give more recognition and honor to others than to yourself. Don't become totally absorbed in your own spiritual growth, but take an interest in other people and help them grow too. You need to think and act like Jesus Christ. From all eternity, he had the very form and nature of God, but equality with God was never something he boasted about. Christ always honored the Father above himself. In fact, he has always been willing to put self aside like a servant, which in no way detracts from his equality with God, even though he took on man's nature. As a human being, he obeyed God in everything, even when God led him to Calvary to die on the cross for us. This is why God can exalt him, because he's so selfless. God had rightfully given him a name above every other name in heaven and on earth. The time is coming when all beings in heaven and on earth will bow at his feet. Everyone will confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
Can you hear me? Oh, there you go. All right. Don't you just love electronics? I know, been working at the county and part-time doing contact tracing for COVID. And sometimes when the electronics work, the day goes smoothly. But when it doesn't work, it gets frustrating, and the people that call in get frustrated too. So, but anyway, I'm just glad we have the wonderful electronics that we have today. The title of my talk today is kind of a teaser for you. It says, "Does your bucket leak?" You'll find out what this is all about shortly. As many of us get older, we find ourselves identifying music from a particular time in our life. We might find ourselves singing to ourselves the lyrics of the song or humming along. Music that came from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and on, you get what I mean. Well, it's amazing to me how many tunes and verses that I actually can remember. Sometimes I enlist the help of Dale. At home, I like to listen to a certain music or instrumental channel on our satellite TV. They're familiar tunes, and so without looking at the screen that identifies what the name of the song is, I will listen to it for a little bit, and then I'll turn to him and I'll say, it's whatever the title of the song is. And he'll sometimes say, yes, no, or what did you say? I have hummed along with the Kingston Trio song that talks about where have all the flowers gone. That's what we feel right now. Where have all the flowers gone? I have listened to the Patty Page song, Beautiful Tennessee Waltz. That's one that my parents liked, Beautiful Tennessee Waltz. And silently sung the words to myself. And I have also chuckled at Elvis Presley crooning, "You're nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time." I can remember when that song came out. Some of you probably can too. There's one song, however, that I have not heard in a coon's age. And some of you will probably recognize it. It's an old ballad titled, "There's a Hole in the Bucket." You remember that one? There's a hole in the bucket. It's one of those round the circle songs where 3.5 minutes later, you wind up exactly where you began. Sometimes not knowing how you really got there. It's a two-person song, a Henry and Liza song. Now, in some areas of the country, it's known as a Georgie and Liza song. But the way I learned it, it was Henry and Liza. So I'm going to refer to it today as Henry and Liza. Henry is the what I would call the mentally challenged one, who begins complaining to Liza. And Liza, I think of as having it all together until you get to the end of the song. And then you begin to wonder about her. That starts out Henry saying to Liza, "There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole." And this causes Liza to respond, "Then mend it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then mend it, dear Henry. Dear Henry, mend it." Well, maybe you can see why this song has the wonderful lyrics of all time. Henry asks, "With what shall I mend it, dear Liza?" And she answers, it must have been a very small hole because she answers, "With a straw, dear Henry." Henry then poses the possibility that the straw is too long, and leads to Liza suggesting, "Then cut it, Henry, cut it." Henry ponders, "With what shall I cut it, dear Liza?" And Liza states, "With a knife, dear Henry." Be patient, we're just warming up. We're getting there. Henry then speculates that the knife is too dull. Liza responds by telling him, obviously, to sharpen it. He then wants to know, "With what shall I sharpen it?" And Liza instructs him, "With a knife." No, wait. Cut it with a knife, but the knife is too dull, so how do I sharpen it? With a rock. And this elicits a response from Henry, well, the rock needs to be wet. With what shall I wet it? And Liza says, with water. Wet it with water. And by this time, Liza's getting a little bit exasperated. And Henry, thinking that, hey, with water, I'll wet the rock or the stone with water. That's the answer. But with what shall I fetch it? Liza, with what shall I fetch it? And Liza responds, with the bucket, dear Henry, with the bucket. Well, you can probably picture it now as Henry has the satisfaction of telling her, there's a hole in the bucket, Liza. There's a hole in the bucket. Have you known anybody like that who has a hole in their bucket? Maybe you've had a hole in your bucket. I know I've had a hole in my bucket from time to time. There's a story that was told of someone who years ago was involved in a crisis hotline business. Well, she attended a national conference of social type workers where she learned a bunch of stuff, made a ton of friends, and came home with one wonderful image in her head of a bucket with a hole in it. One of the keynote speakers had said, all of us carry a bucket about waist high. Some of us attach it to our belt, hook it in our pants, or fasten it to our skirt, whatever. Our buckets may be of different sizes, different colors, different materials, or different shapes, but all of us have one. Well, this figurative bucket is there to collect all of the things that we need to make it through our day or make it through life. They're there to collect good stuff, like affirming stuff, esteem-building stuff, ego-stroking stuff. It's there to collect attaboys and attagirls. It's there to collect accolades and assurances. When life is fair, our bucket is full. We get what we need in the amount that we need and at the time of our need. If our bucket looks a little low, you want to know how you can tell if a person's bucket looks a little low? They look a little low. Folks, hopefully, will rush in to that individual who looks like they have a bucket that's a little low and begin to fill it. They try to do it quietly. Some of them try to do it quietly and unobtrusively, but caringly. Maybe they say a kind word or two. Maybe they mail or email something to that person, like a card or a little note. Or perhaps they put something out there in the air, like a song or a sermon, that falls in that person's bucket. All just when you or I need it the most. Some of you may be wondering, does it really work that way? Well, sure it does, but not always. Not immediately, and not automatically. Buckets do get filled. Our buckets have been filled sometimes to the point of overflowing. Often at the point of greatest need. And it's one of those things when we have a full bucket that makes the crises of the moment seem more bearable. People show up. They ante up. Just when we're running on empty. Especially when the bottom of our bucket looks about as visible as the top of our bucket. Have you noticed, though, however, that there are some people whose buckets never get filled? The good stuff goes in, but it just drains right through. Maybe you have encountered people like that, and so you tried to fill their bucket. You keep filling it, but it keeps draining. There are never enough accolades. There are never enough attaboys. There can never be enough assurances or forgiveness. There can never be enough rewards or recognitions. What we do for them today, we have to do for them tomorrow. Then we've got to do it the next day and the next. Either because they didn't get it the first 3 times, or maybe because they didn't believe it once they got it, or because they couldn't hold on to it, or they couldn't build anything upon it before they lost it. Did you ever meet someone whose ego you could not stroke? Whose esteem you could not build? And whose sins against you couldn't forgive, even though you tried? They heard everything you said. They welcomed everything you did, but it all leaked out within minutes after you said it or after you did it. Several years ago, 1998 to be exact, a young woman came in second in the Winter Olympic figure skating competition that was occurring in Japan. She was from the United States. She had skated magnificently. And she actually seemed to be pleased with her performance. But her performance left a very small crack in it. Just small enough that you or I, if some of you remember watching the program, didn't pick up on it. We thought that she had locked the competition for the gold medal. But through that crack skated another ice skater from the United States. This second skater was also well known to us, and she was well loved by us. This second skater overtook the first skater and claimed the gold medal. This left the first girl gracious in defeat, though weeping in disappointment. Before the TV cameras, the first girl expressed her congratulations to the winner. She expressed her love for her coaches and family members, but then in a whisper that we could not hear, but we had to read lips to get what she was saying, she said, "I hope you still love me." Who knows where that came from in Michelle Kwan? But there it is, an empty bucket, which also happens to us occasionally, and to some of us time after time after time. Those who are more assertive simply ask for what they want. I actually envy people who feel free to walk up to someone. Of course, in the days of COVID, we can't do this, but I can remember when we could. I need a hug. You remember doing that? I need a hug. Patty, I remember you doing that several times, and me doing it to you several times, right? I need a hug. Or they're not bashful to ask for a hand. or hope, a kind word, or even, would you pray for me? Unfortunately, the perpetually needy say nothing. Instead, they keep pushing and or thrusting their bucket out in our face, in the direction of everyone they meet. Can you fill my bucket? Do you have something for my bucket? The bucket seems to speak volumes. Stroke me. Bless me. Forgive me. Fill me. And actually those things work for a while. But pretty soon people get tired of putting stuff into buckets, especially when those buckets seem to leak a lot. So the attention drops off, the affirmation drops off, and the needy are written off as neurotic. Even a new pastor who wonders why he can't ever seem to do enough, say enough, or give enough to meet someone's need is told by another church member, don't take it personally, Pastor. That's just Joe or Jane or Dick or Sally. They will consume everything you've got to give. It will never be enough. 5 minutes after you give it, they'll discard it. Forget you ever said it. Or find some way to twist it from a positive to a negative. That's just the way they are. Or perhaps that's just the way you or I am. At what point does it become, here's a good one for you, at what point does it become a theological problem? Psychology might explain it. However, I have a feeling that only theology can fix it. Theology can help in 2 ways. It can confirm our identity, and secondly, it can do it by strategy. So let me explain. First, let's talk about identity. So I'm going to ask you a question. Who tells you who you are? Really? Who tells you who you are? Doesn't God tell us who we are? But God doesn't stop there. What else does he tell us? He tells us how much we are worth, which is probably a whole lot more than you or I ever imagined, and probably a whole lot more than we ever insured ourselves for. If we look at ourselves and see dirt, and God sees us as diamonds, whose opinion should matter most? God's should. God should. There was a former university professor and preacher by the name of Fred Craddock who died in the year 2015 at the age of 86. CNN, in reporting about his death, called him a preaching genius. Pastor Craddock told the following story. Some of you have probably already heard it, but I believe it bears repeating because it helps to illustrate the point. He and his wife, Nettie, were on vacation in the Smoky Mountains having dinner. It was a wonderful restaurant, lofty elevation, window table, quiet, intimate. Suddenly, an older gentleman came over to the table and introduced himself. Said Fred, he was a nice enough fellow, but I really didn't want this thing to stretch on and on, you know. After a while, the gentleman asked Fred what he did. Fred, in telling the story, said, I made a mistake. I told the truth. I told him I was a preacher who taught preachers. Whereupon the old gentleman pulled up a chair to Fred's table and said, Good, I've got a story to tell you. The older man even shanghaied a waitress and asked for pie and coffee before launching into his story. But what a story it was. This is what he said. When I was a little boy growing up in eastern Tennessee, I was embarrassed, you see. My mother had never married. As a matter of fact, I never knew who my father was. In town, I was simply known as the illegitimate boy, and you know what they called me. Sometimes they would snicker and talk, and I would see them whispering when I was around. I heard rumors that my father was a drunk somewhere. It was a shameful way to live. When I was in junior high school, I began to attend a little church in the town. Each Sunday, I would slip into the back pew. Then, as the last hymn would start, I would get up and leave. But the preacher picked up on my pattern, noticing that I always came late and left early. So, one Sunday, when the organist started the closing hymn, the preacher hurried to the back of the church and stood between me and the door. There was no way out. I knew I wasn't going to be able to leave without being greeted. As the hymn ended, I stepped into the aisle and tried to slip through the crowd. But the preacher restrained me, putting his hand on my shoulder in a voice that could be heard by everybody around. He said something that just about brought me to tears. He said, "Now let's see. I don't know we've met. Whose child are you?" Before I could say anything, the preacher answered his own question. "Oh, I know. You are the child of, Yes, I got it. You are clearly the child of God. I see a striking resemblance." After talking a while and finishing his pie, the older fellow got up to leave, whereupon Fred said, "You know, I never got your name." The old man smiled and said, "The name's Hooper. I was fortunate enough to serve 2 terms as governor of the state of Tennessee." So much for identity. So now for a word about strategy. How do we get the good stuff for our buckets? The kind stuff, the helpful stuff, the healing stuff, the merciful and forgiving stuff from leaking out of the bottom of our buckets. Well, I'm here to give you a clue, if you've ever wondered. We empty our buckets from the top to the bottom before it slips out through the bottom. We give it back, we give it out, and we give it away. We actually fill our buckets by emptying them. Well, this can be frightening for some people when we don't think our bucket contains much, because we want to hoard what little we have. But the principle of the gospel is that we gain by losing. We keep by letting go, and we achieve unselfishness as the byproduct of an outpouring of service. Remember the words of Paul that were read earlier, that Dale read earlier. He has always been willing to put self aside like a servant, which in no way detracts from his equality with God, even though he took on man's nature. As a human being, he obeyed God in everything, even when God led him to Calvary to die on a cross for us. This is why God can exalt him, meaning Jesus. This is why God can exalt him, because he, Jesus, is so selfless. God has rightfully given him a name above every other name in heaven and on earth. This suggests that the cross was a choice, not a circumstance. Most of us see it just the opposite. We talk about the crosses we have to bear, right? We talk about the crosses we have to bear as if they are pieces of luggage, very heavy life's luggage. Oh me, oh my, I have a hangnail that's infected. Or this bum knee, or this bum hip, this boss, this coworker, this congregation that grumbles. You don't do that, do you? This congregation that grumbles, this colon that rumbles, this house, this louse, this spouse. I guess it's just the cross I'm saddled with. Guess what? Jesus never talked about the cross as something he was saddled with. He talked about it as something he volunteered for. The verb is an active one. Take it up, he said, for it is the way that leads to life. By the way, do you know what the difference between a cross and a burden is? A cross is something you bear for someone's benefit. Isn't that what Jesus said? That is precisely what will help to save us, bearing someone else's burdens. There's another story that talks about an elderly patient who was wearing a frayed bathrobe, who was shuffling back and forth in a hospital corridor. It was the aimless movement or shuffle of one who felt like he had outlived his time. Suddenly, he heard a name being called. It was his name. He turned toward the voice that called him. The caller was a nurse's aide, and she was pushing a cart filled with pitchers of crushed ice. There occurred a mumbled conversation between the two of them. During that conversation, the elderly patient at first looked like he had disbelief on his face. And then it changed to a look of determination. The nurse's aide had asked him to help deliver those pitchers of crushed ice to the patients. Need had saved him. Mercy in a white uniform had smiled on him. The old man shuffled. His hands still trembled. And I'm sure efficiency ratings for that day must have tumbled drastically. However, if you looked in the eyes of the elderly gentleman, you would have been able to tell that he had been touched by grace. Fearing that his stamina could not survive the test, the aide pointed down the corridor and said, "We've got all the way to the end of the hall, and then we'll be done." To which the elderly gentleman replied, "Honey, I'd go to the end of the world for you." You know, not long ago, I was on Facebook, and I'm not sure whose site I was on, but I just had to print this. It was a picture of a sign that apparently was outside of a business. And let me read that sign to you. It just really struck a chord with me, and I hope it does the same for you. Today, you could be standing next to someone who is trying their best not to fall apart. Whatever you do today, do it with kindness in your heart. In the book, In Heavenly Places, on page 230, it reads, "We must forget self in loving service for others. We may not remember some act of kindness which we do, but eternity will bring out in all its brightness every act done for the salvation of souls, every word spoken for the comfort of God's children. And these deeds done for Christ's sake will be a part of our joy through all eternity." Let me read that again. These deeds done for Christ's sake will be a part of our joy for all eternity. Let's pray. Our Father, may we always have eyes that see the best in people, hearts that forgive the worst, minds that forget the bad, and souls that never lose faith in you. Amen.